Hi, everybody, and welcome back, or welcome to HCD's Mindset series. This is season 2. Today, we are welcoming back Sai. He's going to talk to us about a little bit about research and data and dealing with data. So we're talking about consumer acceptability versus scientific validity and where those lines cross or don't meet at all. So without further ado, let's launch right into today's conversation, where we're going to start with an intro to mindset. As always, you are being led through this by myself, Michelle Niedziela. I'm VP of Research and Innovation at HCD, and I'm joined with Kathryn Ambroze. Kathryn.
Hi, everybody. Kathryn Ambroze here. I am the Manager of Behavioral and Marketing Sciences with HCD Research, and we're really excited to have Sai join us today. We've spent a good amount of time together in the UK when I was over there, and I'm happy to have him on the show. So without further ado, I'm going to let Michelle share a little bit about HCD before we chat with him.
So those of you that are new, welcome, and those of you that are returning, welcome back. HCD, if you're not aware who we are a market research company, a research house where we provide research capabilities for understanding how consumers perceive, evaluate, and respond to different types of stimuli. We use all sorts of innovative methodologies, all sorts of different tools to be able to do this, ranging from neuroscience and psychology all the way through traditional market research tools like surveys, qual and quant. And our applied consumer neuroscience approaches help our clients really understand how consumers interact with different types of stimuli. And that could be stimuli ranging from products all the way through marketing and communication. So we do our research in the early stages of exploration in these types of product development, all the way through validation in marketing. Our work can be done online or in person, and so we've done it also globally. So our labs can really go anywhere that you are measuring people. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and launch into our discussion by introducing Sai. Kathryn, do you want to give a little bit of introduction?
Sure. So Sai, or Simon Noyce, is a researcher, a behavioral consultant, and an educator. He's really quite accomplished, and I'll let Simon share a little bit more about his personal journey. So I kind of alluded to this before, but where in the world are you?
So I'm in Taunton, which is in the southwest of England at the moment. We're enjoying the spring weather turning, which has been very good.
Awesome. And can you share a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, so at the moment, I'm a high school teacher, but I've kind of got to that point from quite a convoluted journey. So I started off with a psychology undergraduate degree back in the early 1990s. And from there, I became interested in psychophysics and things such as autism and dyslexia. At that point, things like applied behavior analysis for working with children with autism was really new in the UK, and I was lucky to get involved with an American team working on early intervention in the UK. And I then got interested in working with that particular group of individuals, trained under some of the leading Norwegian consultants at the time as well, which was really interesting. And from there, I became very sort of involved with working with low functioning kids that have high levels of repetitive and restrictive behaviors, which, if you know anything about autism, this is often what makes them stand out and seem uncharacteristic from their peers. It was that involvement that really led me down a research route. I became interested in what the purpose of these behaviors are for these individuals. So I began a PhD, and that has eventually led me into the university sector, where I lectured for nearly 2 decades. So my research interests largely stem from working with sort of psychophysiological data. And as you know, that can obviously be quite complicated. So for typical sort of practical experiments, you're looking at thousands of data points per second. But the nice thing about obviously looking at things like changes in electrophysiology and hormonal responses is we get an idea of the biological drivers that sit behind some of these behaviors. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I like an excuse to look at some complicated data, and that kind of got me involved in research methods and stats. And now I say, very pleased to have shifted to sort of secondary school education, And working with sort of 16 to 18-year-olds is very, very different. It brings a level of enthusiasm to what I do that you don't get working with adults. So yeah, it's been an odd journey.
That's awesome. It's so interesting how, each step kind of leads you to the next. And I think especially with your background in statistics and research, that you can really take that and bring it anywhere. And there's a lot to be said too for taking all this really complicated data and translating it to whatever your audience is, whether it's, high schoolers or it's clients or, other researchers that maybe are in a different field. So that is a skill that is really, I think, in my opinion, it's underappreciated because it's so valuable. And it's a big part of what we do as science communicators, is really finding a way to effectively share information.
Data science is such a huge and growing area. And I think I really appreciate that you're doing in the secondary education, because it's very good for people to sort of understand all these sort of ideas better, because then they become better critical thinkers, right?
Yeah, I think the thing that's really struck me is when you look at, certainly in the UK A-level specifications that we have, that the demand on getting those key concepts is really central now, which I think is brilliant. And looking back on my education, when I started my degree, actually a lot of those things were very new. But certainly for young people coming up now, that expectation is that they'll have an understanding of these principles early on. But yeah, I think if you can explain things like standard deviation to a 15-year-old, you're onto a bit of a winner.
Absolutely. And so it's interesting, especially with your background that's kind of, been across a lot of different sectors, right? So you've been in academia, done some clinical work, you've, worked a bit in market research as well, definitely, collaborating with us quite a bit most recently. I thought it'd be good to sort of talk about how these things are actually somewhat similar, that, they seem like these totally different silos of research going on out there in the world, but they've all got a similar goal, which is really solving problems, right? So, in academia, it's all often like a specific kind of thesis, right? Some sort of basic science idea or something more complicated. Clinical it's a lot about efficacy or really understanding clinical disorders or something like that. And then in market research, we're trying to solve more business-related problems or consumer-related problems. But it's all using data to really understand better what's going on. Do you think you could speak a little bit to your experiences and how maybe that's been different across those different boards?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're dead right in the sense that we are, as a species, trying to make sense of the world around us, and we do that by quantifying things. And I know there's a whole school of qualitative research out there, but for most of us, we want to look at how things vary so we can make comparisons. So I suppose from my personal experience, seeing a child engage in a repetitive behavior such as hand flapping, the first question is, well, how much hand flapping do you need before it becomes a clinical problem?
Right.
So just trying to get an index on what is a normal behavior, and certainly from a typical perspective, we all have these what we call body focus behaviors. So there'll be people out there that are avid knee twitchers, chewers, hair twiddlers. I don't do the hair twiddling anymore. But they will be considered normal. It's only when you start looking at a child that will engage in these repetitive behaviors for, maybe 6 hours a day if they're allowed to, that you start to realize that there are different sort of levels at which these things operate. But obviously, to make sense of that and see how that varies from child to child, you need good quantifiable data in terms of duration, intensity, for example. And I guess dare say it's very similar in terms of your market research, that you want to know how a consumer perceives a product and the strength of that perception. So I think in many respects, there are so many similarities. I think the difference is in terms of how well each of those groups possibly goes about planning how it investigates those avenues. I think once you get a bit of awareness about how data and statistics work, you're kind of more likely to pose your questions with that in mind, rather than trying to shoehorn your data into an analysis sort of after the event. So having a clear idea beforehand can be really informing.
So the scientific method is definitely important to consider, that you really need to plan and be aware what you're getting into.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you really brought up a important point too in discussing what is the norm, what is considered your baseline, what are you comparing it against? And that is something that we stress so much in market research, but it is applicable obviously for clinical research when you're trying to understand, a student's behavior, or if you're trying to understand anybody's behavior. It's having that norm to use to really draw comparisons against. And
there's something interesting that we always talked about in grad school. It was a little bit of a debate. So I did a lot of work with rodent models, where we would try to focus on a particular type of, say, disorder, right? So a lot of the neuroscience and psychology research out there tends to focus on disordered patients or disordered populations. And then so it becomes very difficult to say, well, what is normal, right? And how generalizable is some of that data when you're, working with a rodent population that, is being given a very specific diet, in a very controlled environment. Like, how generalizable is that really when you move maybe from that academic to, the more everyday life sort of situations? Or, even that a lot of clinical data is based on disordered patients. So, our understanding of brain diseases or brain damage is mostly based off of, case studies where there is a problem. It's not normal, right? What are your thoughts on sort of that?
Well, I think interestingly, the autism field itself has gone down mouse models for autism, for example, and they can be very, very informative because you've got control. And again, I think this is what we're really talking about. It's that trade-off between good control, maybe in a very artificial setting, or poor control in a very real-world setting, sort of having ecological validity and mundane realism over that structured environment that you'd have in a lab, where you can be certain that your variables are being controlled in detail. Obviously, I think there's a place for both, and I think we're looking at quite extreme examples here. But again, I think animal models will only ever take us so far.
Yeah.
But it's one of those areas that has become popular and has emerged successfully for looking at a whole range of things.
Especially when it comes to genetics and behavioral neurogenetics, for example. But yeah, there is that leap that has to be taken a little bit. We have an interesting graphic here that we always like to talk about a lot, which is, the intersection of any methodology or approach being cheap, fast, and good, right? And so when we're working with clients, they want things to be fast. They want quick turnaround. They also want it to be accurate. So they want it to be a good, process that we're doing, a good research that we're doing, but it also somehow has to be cheap. And we kind of joke, and it is like the joke that's out there, that the intersection doesn't exist, right? You can certainly be good and fast, but it's going to cost you, right? Or it can be good and cheap, but it's going to take a long time. Or it can be fast and cheap, but that's probably not going to be very good, right? You get what you pay for. Have you experienced this in your different lives?
Yeah, I guess from an academic perspective, you're always quite lucky that you're often able to work on things that you're very passionate about, and you're quite dislocated from often the real world in that context. Certainly from my experience with, say, working with real world data from children with autism, say from the perspective of electrophysiology, where you're getting thousands and thousands of data points, it's really rich data. You can get very fast responses. But yeah, it's a nightmare to analyze because you have so much data to work through. So I think finding that sweet spot is the holy grail, really. You're right, and if you can do one of those three well without compromising the other two, you're probably ahead of the curve. I think it's about asking the right question, though, and sometimes I think all of us do this. We make the questions we ask more complicated than we need to, and that can result in a lot more complications in terms of our data analysis. So yeah, I think sometimes asking simple questions well takes us further than answering complex questions and having to try to work out the mess we get as a result.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So true.
Yeah,
everybody often wants to throw the kitchen sink in when they're doing their research.
And you brought up a really great point too, by saying how, and at some point you had shared with us that statistics really is an art, that you want to be like really appropriately showing what the data is telling you. And in order to do that, it really comes down to asking a simple question, because it makes it clearer for you to draw those comparisons and to really be able to say what is good research when you're doing it maybe in a quick manner. And I think that there is a lot to that. And it's really a foundational thing, like we had talked about in the scientific method.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, thinking about even simple things like the type of data you have. I mean, obviously, from a statistical point of view, there's this pressure to work with parametric tests because they're sensitive. And ultimately, we've grown up with a culture in research where we're looking for significant results. And I think that has generally biased us in the sense that if you're trying to publish, for example, and you've got an interesting project, but there's nothing significant to show, that doesn't make the headlines and that doesn't make the cut as far as getting into a journal is concerned.
Yeah.
So there is a whole graveyard of dead ends that we often don't know about.
Yeah.
I think we need to embrace this idea of sometimes not finding something is as informative as actually finding something.
Absolutely. And I feel like, it's the publisher perish world that's also kind of pushed that as well, in academia. Everybody wants to push for getting meaningful, important, nature journal, science journal worthy publications. But the fact of the matter is, if you look at, sort of the beginnings of science, people were able to publish things that were negative results, whereas now it's nearly impossible to. And now we have real problems of people, you look at Retraction Watch and you see a lot of falsified data. I mean, the pressure out there to get, significant results has dire consequences, I think.
Yeah,
for everybody, if you think about it, because then there's so much research out there that you could have saved time and money by just seeing something in a null hypothesis, and that's okay.
Yeah. But I think this is when we get into those hazy areas that there's always that temptation, because there is this pressure to get a result, that people then start to take liberties with their data.
Yeah.
And I think we have to bear in mind that there are things you can do with data when it doesn't look like it's behaving how you expect it to. But it's where you draw the line with your transformations, for example, that would be acceptable. But yeah, I think we are seeing better practice emerge. Lots of researchers now will publish their data online, so you can scrutinize that independently. So we're moving towards more transparency, but I think we're still a long way from that being the norm.
Yeah, and some of that is those expectations, right? So I know in the market research side and the business side, it's not very acceptable to get no significant results, even though it's entirely a possibility, right? It's just the nature of how things are. Not everything is going to be significant. I mean, of course, if you design your study properly, you can do it in a way that's you'll be able to recognize things, but sometimes there isn't a winner, right?
But I think this is where it gets very interesting, in the sense that if we deal with your kind of sphere of cheap, obviously quantifying things so we can process them statistically in a very sort of rapid and dynamic way is what we're aiming for. But actually, for a lot of things, it's actually the qualitative experience that people have that isn't easy to quantify, that actually might be more informative. But that is a very expensive and a very long-winded route in comparison. So we don't see as much of that emerging as possibly we should do.
Yeah, absolutely. I've kind of said before that in a lot of the sort of look for more and more data, we've kind of lost the consumer experience, right? So at least in our type of work, people just want so much data, things that are very like machine learning or, AI driven or very tech savvy. And then you start to lose that consumer qualitative experience. That's a really interesting point.
I mean, clinical has got better. If you think about, say, someone's perception of a drug treatment, for example, if you ask, a qualitative question on a scale of 1 to 5, how do you feel after your treatment? That's a very different set of data to asking someone, well, how did the treatment make you feel? What problems are you facing as a result of that? What in your life has improved? So I think it all depends what you want to capture. And again, I think that comes down to the questions you ask early on.
Right. And that kind of brings us to, what is the right test? What are the right questions? Because as you're suggesting, the power of statistics really relies on those basic approaches that you should really consider beforehand. Otherwise, it can be potentially even more difficult to get your data to do what you want it to do, right? So if you didn't ask the right question to begin with, that can be a lot more difficult.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as I say, often planning your research with the data in mind from the start really helps, though. Making sure you're asking the right type of questions, collecting the right type of data that gives you the ability to test what you're interested in. I think often people start with a question and then realize they've asked it possibly in a way that doesn't necessarily lend itself well to being actually investigated statistically. So yeah, I mean, it depends on what you're asking and kind of how aware you are of how you manipulate that once you get your data back in.
I think as things move into the cheaper and faster, people also want things to be sort of automated or have high throughput. And I think one thing we've talked about with you quite a bit is that can be quite risky, right? But you really do need to continue to sort of check in to make sure that your statistical approach is still valid, because, as your population changes, as, the things that you're testing change, this can certainly change the approach that you should be using.
Yeah. I mean, at a fundamental level, obviously, if we're thinking about sort of typical parametric tests, you've got to meet the criteria that enable you to actually perform those tests. And it's always tempting to think, well, yeah, the data's fine, but actually in an automated process, you may not be able to pick out obvious things like outliers or skew. Okay, good statistical packages will do that for you, but those packages don't always lend themselves very well to, automating that process. So yeah, I think you do need a human touch. You do need to keep an eye on actually what the data's doing and make those decisions in light of what you're faced with.
Or even, in academia, I know that often it can just be that people become a little bit lazy, right? So, you did an ANOVA in your last research project, or, the research project, the publication you were reading, they used this approach, so you should probably use that approach too, rather than doing the appropriate test beforehand, right?
Yeah, I mean, if I'm strictly honest, I mean, having worked with numerous undergraduate students over the years, most of them will make the same fundamental mistakes, that they will pick a test that they feel confident with rather than actually exploring what else you could do.
I think we're all guilty of that.
Yeah. And, at one level, there's a degree of kind of reassurance that a lot of the packages that are being used, things like SPSS, are very robust. And if you run a parametric test and a non-parametric test, often you're going to get the kind of same outcome. But it's not always the case. And certainly if you're dealing with small differences that are very sensitive, getting that test choice right is the difference between finding something and not finding it. You want to be finding an effect and not an outlier.
Yeah, so like if you're trying to make a business decision and you're not using the right test, then you may be passing up on an opportunity or going with something, spending millions of dollars where you didn't need to, or if you think in the clinical aspect, the safety of something, just making sure you do it right is very important. So you got to choose carefully.
Absolutely. And with that being said, the idea of 0.05 being the end all be all is not necessarily true, because you can have something that maybe is significant 0.49 and be really close, but not have that exact thing. It still is probably telling you something similar to whatever 0.51 is telling you.
Right.
And that's something
the whole key fishing thing is definitely something that people need to be aware of. But also, I remember it being very much drilled into us that you shouldn't say that something is close to significance, right? Because it's significant or it's not significant. It's not that it's close to significance. Is that, what do you think about that, Si?
I think it depends what you're using your data for. I mean, normally if you're thinking about something being close, the first question at the back of my mind is, how big's your sample? And often the reason that we're not getting significance for small effects is either we're not running enough trials or we're not testing enough people. So you then get into an interesting point. Well, if you then look at it and you suddenly find you can get significance with 5 extra people in, has it become more significant, or have you just got over the threshold of numbers?
Yeah. Because something can't actually be more significant, right? It's either significant or not.
Yeah. And then if you have significance, I mean, there are issues around things like effect size and power. So, just because you have a significant result doesn't necessarily mean it's, got a large effect size.
Right.
So, it can become immensely complicated when you're navigating this. And again, this is where I think a straightforward automated process will often fall down, that you need someone that can actually look at those figures in more detail and actually make an informed decision, often based on some experience. But yeah, I mean, I think we're all obsessed with this idea of nudging it over the line.
Absolutely. So when we're thinking about these decisions that are being made, at least in our field, when we're looking at understanding the consumer experience, we're usually trying to look at things that are driving behavior. And, with your experience working in, with autism and things like that, that you're also looking for drivers of different behavior, even in the physiology. It's like you said before, really understanding the mechanisms behind behaviors. So what do you see as the key to that sort of research that you look for when you're moving into trying to interpret data?
Again, I think so much depends on the type of question you're asking. And sometimes it's knowing how to look. I mean, when we think about behavior changes very rapidly. And sometimes things that influence behavior happen before the behavior is emitted. So I think the thing I've learned, certainly when you're looking at changes in arousal states, is that the antecedent that triggers that change might have occurred seconds before. And if you're not looking back past the change itself, you're not going to actually pick it up. Likewise, different behaviors have different kind of effects in terms of how long they last. So sometimes thinking about the kind of time plane itself is very useful. But again, that creates a whole different set of complexities when we're looking at analysis. And again, from a consumer point of view, I guess that if you're trying to do something that's quick and concise, that isn't always, compatible with picking up these changes over time as well. So yeah, I think it's complicated. It's probably the short answer.
Absolutely. And
I know that people often look at, simple questions such as liking and calling that really a driving of behavior. So how much do you like a product and how much is that really influencing your purchase? But I know one thing that's really been interesting is that nobody really understands why people purchase. As much as we talk about it and all the research that's being done, there really isn't a very good predictor of purchase behavior. So, trying to understand drivers of behavior has been quite complicated.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so many factors, aren't there? I mean, there's purchasing because of need and out of necessity. And then we all know that feeling that you get from purchasing something that you want because it makes you feel a certain way. So there's a biochemistry that comes into some of these things. I think like a quick hit of dopamine being reinforced by the shiny thing that you're interested in. So yeah, I think it depends so much on what we're talking about in terms of, I mean, buying carrots and potatoes is very different from buying, tech and beauty products, for example. I don't know.
Or purchasing chocolate versus, textbooks. So sorry, Kathryn, it sounded like you were going to ask something.
Yeah, so I was curious, with the work that you've done in your past, how would you recommend trying to combine mixed methods to really get the best result from your research question? What would you suggest for people that are trying to take information from different streams of data?
I mean, I think when you've got the ability to triangulate, that opens up a lot of very powerful possibilities. So, I mean, if you've got a combination of quantitative and qualitative approaches, and they're leading in the same direction, that can be really useful. I mean, there is a general trend in research that often will ask qualitative questions to kind of scope an area out. And then once we've got a feel for what's going on, that lends itself often more to a quantitative approach. But yeah, again, from my experience, I mean, certainly when you're working with non-verbal children, you don't get much of an opportunity to actually ask. For some of the research I've looked at with older individuals with ASD, then yeah, I think a qualitative level of input can be really informative, because often as someone that's outside of that experience, just asking and collecting data on its own doesn't give you those subtle nuances. But I suppose it depends on how much context you want. How much time you want to spend exploring that context versus, making comparisons. So yeah, I don't know. I think it's problematic, and it depends so much on the things you're interested in and the time and resources available to you.
Absolutely. Well, I think this has been another great conversation, and I really appreciate you jumping on with us. I know, teaching and everything, you're right in the mix of things right now with your students. And so, definitely thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for joining us. Please make sure to subscribe to this channel and also like and comment on this video. We'd love to have you along as more of these get released. So please subscribe to find out when our next one will be. Also, feel free to reach out to us. You can email Kathryn or I. You can tweet with us. You can read our blog. You can join us on LinkedIn, and of course, follow us here on YouTube. So I want to have a big thank you to Sai again for joining us and for all the help that he's given us most recently, some great conversations that we've had with him, and thank all of you. So everybody have a wonderful day, and we'll enjoy to see you next time. Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye.